thank you very much. Thank you for the welcomes and the introductions to the colloquium, and thank you for the invitation to visit Southern Illinois again. I think I was here about a year ago and wasn't able to spend as much time as I would have liked. The weather was not as nice as it is now, and so I'm really very, very honored and pleased to be back. Also, I'll join others to congratulate Professor Downing and the others associated with this terrific institute. Many of the people involved with the institute, including John, I usually see in various international settings, and I want to also just note that your faculty here, if you didn't know, are really very well known internationally in the field of media and communication. And it's great to see them all here. I'm really not sure how this topic came about, but I'm sure it was probably at one of those international conferences late at night when Professor Downing, I'm sorry I have to call him JD, and I were possibly talking about ideas, former papers, future papers, and so forth. And I guess, I'm not even remembering very well, that we possibly started talking about this, this theory of the propaganda model and what we thought about it. And there were some reasons why we were talking about that, as I recall, too. But anyway, so when this opportunity to visit came up, this topic came up. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the propaganda model and what it is and where it came from and so forth. But primarily, we associate this with a specific book, Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media, that was first published in 1988. Someone just happened to talk about this model in this book, saying that the model has been both touted as the ultimate truth and exorciated as trash conspiracy theory. It's also perhaps one of the most widely known theories of contemporary media. And I think we'll give bonus points to anyone who recognizes this quote, because the person who wrote it is in the room. Maybe some of you are a colleague of his or a student of his. Maybe he doesn't recognize it himself, but this is from Professor Downing, for a paper that he was to deliver at one of the recent conferences that were devoted to this particular theory. The authors are fairly well known, especially in the field of media and communication, but I think beyond that. Noam Chomsky actually is a professor of linguistics, but certainly has gone way beyond linguistics and has written a number of really interesting books and is involved in a lot of really important political discussions these days. He worked with Edward Herman, who also comes from kind of outside of the field of media. He's a real economist who was at the Wharton School for many years. He's authored numerous books, a few of them with Chomsky. And is still quite active in a lot of political activities, has his own column online and so forth. So Herman and Chomsky, the propaganda model, has been a very popular theory and model that's been introduced to students in media for many years. There were numerous editions of this. This was done in 1988, and it's been reprinted and new editions constantly added. Chomsky has a long video where he talks about it and so forth. Most recently, in 2007, there was one conference in Canada that explored this model to see whether it was still relevant 20 years after it was written. And I believe that's the paper that you wrote, the conference paper that you wrote. And then another one more recently, last year, a conference in the UK that also directed attention to the Herman Chomsky propaganda model. So there's been a lot of recent attention to this model. Not to say that it's still not controversial. There are those who love it, there are those who reject it. What is the propaganda model? And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I thought I would just highlight what I think is, in a sense, the essence of it. Herman and Chomsky talk about 5 general kind of filters that determine the type of news that's presented in news media. They include ownership, funding sources, sourcing, flack, and anti-ideology. And I'll go through those in a little more detail, but I'm not going to go into too much depth. They argue that this applies to most any country that basically shares the same economic structure as the U.S. So they're not just talking about the U.S. There are a lot of other arguments that they make, but I think those are the key points that are made, these specific filters. I want to talk a little bit more about the filters and try to just summarize them rather quickly. My arrow takes forever to get out of there. The first one is ownership. It's very basic. They argue that the mainstream media in the U.S. and many other countries are corporations or part of big conglomerates, media conglomerates, and thus news will be biased according to those interests. Whoever owns the media will have their interests represented. We're familiar with some of this, especially in this country, Fox and their news. I'm sure all of you know the video Outfoxed. And we've had recent examples of the kind of news bias that happens that really does represent an owner's perspective. I am going to present lots of kind of illustrations that are just pulled from online, and no copyright has been arranged. So, but certainly we're all familiar with this. Not only do we have a certain kind of bias that may represent an owner's perspective, but also the media doesn't talk about the kind of media ownership issues, and it's not too surprising that they don't cover those issues very well. The second filter is funding. Where does the media get its funding? For the most part, advertising interests are supportive of news coverage usually, and advertising interests, Chomsky and Herman argue, come before reporting of news. They also argue that the news itself is nothing more than a filler to get very privileged readers or listeners or viewers to see the ads which make up the real content and will thus take whatever form is most conducive to attracting the educated media decision makers. Again, some of these issues have been taken up as somewhat controversial, but just kind of reviewing what the arguments have been. Stories that conflict with a buying mood when we're watching media, specifically news media, will tend to be marginalized or excluded, along with information that presents a picture of the world that collides with advertisers' interests. And I've worked at television stations where if there's something like a plane crash, you have to take out all the airline ads, for instance, as part of their contract. Things like that happen. In addition, audiences are themselves the products which are sold to the businesses that buy advertising space. The news itself is only a marginal role as the product. We're familiar with this in terms of political economy, which I'll talk about a little bit later, as kind of a basic theory that audiences are sold to advertisers. Well, yes, advertising supports the news, and I just like this image of the cat. I couldn't help it. Obviously, the cat's not being sold to advertisers, but I just thought it was cute. But we certainly are being often sold to advertisers. A third point, a third filter is sourcing. Where does the news get their information? The media need a continuous flow of information to fill their demand for daily news, like sometimes 24-hour news. This information is provided by major businesses, but also government that have the necessary information provided to the media. And thus, a symbiotic relationship develops and arises between the media and the government, which is sustained by a kind of similar economic interest and a reciprocity of interests. Again, an example would be the kind of relationship the government has with the media. They depend on the media, but the government also often gives them what they need. Sometimes this is thought of as conspiratorial. Actually, one of the critiques of the propaganda model is it's too conspiratorial. Flack, the fourth filter, negative responses to media statements or programs that deviate from the status quo. So there's a kind of flack that kind of responds to the kind of media coverage that takes place when it deviates from the status quo. There are targeted efforts to discredit organizations and individuals who disagree with or doubt these kind of established positions of power. And the third area that they talk about are direct or indirect pressure on the media by government or businesses, on watchdog groups and so forth that attack media, and there's kind of a delegitimization of those kinds of organizations that criticize the status quo. Herman and Chomsky call this flack. I don't know if this represents it, but I had to find an image here. Certainly, there's a lot of this that goes on. One of the key elements of, I think, Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model is this notion of ideology and anti-ideologies. The media, they argue, exploit public fear and hatred of groups that pose a potential threat, either real, exaggerated, or imagined. And they certainly did this in 1988. They had a lot of material to draw on as an example of the media kind of building up a fear of communism and socialism. But of course, they have revised this and added that there are other kinds of ideologies that also can be portrayed by the media in these ways. And an example would be terrorism. And we certainly do get this in the media presentations that cover terrorists and terrorism in a specific way, and also by the kind of presentation that of news specifically that really feeds into a kind of fear or a kind of paranoia. And one of the things that I find kind of interesting is these ideas, I kind of plug them in and I find cartoons and humor that express these very well. These aren't academics or scholars, but it's out there. These are kinds of things that are out there in the public, and people are talking about them. Well, okay, the propaganda model, I think, basically has to do with media bias. And it's a specific kind of media that is biased. It's specifically the news and information programming. I don't think there would be any question of that, even though certainly Chomsky and Herman talk about a lot of other details when they're making this argument. But basically, they're saying that the media that we have are biased. There have been lots of discussions of this model, as I said, a couple of conferences recently, but a lot of reaction to it. And I just want to share a couple. Some of you know Professor Sparks from the UK. And at one of these conferences, he wanted to take a sympathetic stance towards the model, but suggested that there are a number of ways in which the propaganda model was insufficiently sensitive to the nature of the pressures and constraints on news production arising from the economic and political reality of capitalist democracy. to emphasize insufficiently sensitive to actual news production, I think is what he's saying. But he added that if you modify the propaganda model a little bit, it's possible to give a much more complete account of news production and to respond effectively to the main criticisms advanced by Herman and Chomsky. From this perspective, he argues, rather than the tendencies toward uniformity predicted by the model, he says it becomes possible to account for the real, if limited, variety of news and opinion that are observable features of mass media. So I think that Sparks wants to open it up a little, still being sympathetic to the model, yet arguing that it's a little more flexible than some people have argued. Yet another scholar, familiar face, has argued that the propaganda model might be considered kind of taking it outside of the template in which it was presented, which I think is news, to assess the degree of conceptual traction the theory may hold when stretched further. And J.D., I think, talked about mainly some of the counter-hegemonic social movements and so forth, but also listed among those areas that needs to be analyzed according to this model, the U.S. entertainment media. Enter the topic that I want to address. Because I think that it may and may not be possible to apply the propaganda model to entertainment. I think that the media are more certainly, it's more about more than just media bias. I think the media are very much about entertainment, and to just apply this model or to talk about news and information is quite limited. And I want to talk about how that might be considered, the propaganda model, how it might be applied to entertainment media. And then I want to also add some thoughts on political economy of the media, because after all, it is the subtitle of Chomsky and Herman's book. Okay. Looking back at those filters, applying it to entertainment media. Ownership, it's the same guys. It's the same companies. It's the same kind of ownership for the most part in the private sector. I think there's absolutely coherence there. It's the same kind of filter. And so there's consistency there. Funding sources, yes. Same thing. There's a hell of a lot of advertising that supports entertainment. Not always, but typically advertising sources provide the funding that make these kinds of cultural products possible. So I think those two specifically apply very well. Sourcing, it's kind of a different, we're talking about something that's a little bit different. Sourcing for entertainment somehow doesn't make sense, but if we think about where do people who produce and distribute entertainment and cultural products get their ideas, everywhere, anywhere, wherever they can get them, right? So that, I think, is quite different from news media and needs a little more, kind of a different analysis. FLAC doesn't quite apply either. There certainly is a lot of feedback concerning entertainment media or cultural products, but it's not quite the same as the news media. Anti-ideology, I would also argue, is a little bit different, and we'll make some other arguments a little bit later. It still can be applied, but I think it needs to be, again, opened up a little bit. I guess one of the things that I want to argue strongly when we start talking about entertainment is that it's not just the manufacture of consent, or maybe there's a contribution to consent of the public, but it is, I believe, better thought of in terms of manufacturing distraction. I'm putting a question mark because it may sound a little too heavy. But I think that there's a good deal of distraction provided by the media, by entertainment media, taking us away from news and information and so forth. And this notion of weapons of mass distraction, I thought was kind of interesting that there's another image for that, and a film made called Weapons of Mass Distraction. Certainly the media provide us with a lot of things to distract us from issues that relate to news. Fantasy is certainly one, and I got kind of stuck here in kind of a alliterative thing. Fun, tons of entertainment promotes fun in lots of ways. Football, I didn't say basketball because I'm in the F thing. Sports in general. Fashion, well, in that we're always looking for cool, the cool. Through reality television, there's a lot of types of distraction, and I don't think I need to make that point more emphatically. It's out there, and there's a wide variety of entertainment media that entice us, that interest us, that distract us. The new media, although it certainly provides us with lots of information, lots more information, and I think your point was very well taken about the kind of information we're getting these days. But I think there also are even more distractions provided by the new media. Lots of different kinds of distractions, and this, I'm just pulling a few examples. Just to keep up with the new media and to use all of these new sources takes a lot of our time. Just figuring out how to access information, how to get to different things that we want by way of the media. It also provides us a possibility of tuning out. And I really like Harold's Planet that I get every day, that they often portray a kind of interesting element that connects to the media. But I don't know about all of you, but I walk into the graduate office where I work, and everyone's sitting at their desk with headphones on. And everywhere you go, they've got headphones on. Well, maybe some of you do too. But it certainly does also influence the kind of information and news that some people are tuned into. It starts very young, of course, with lots of attractions for kids and young people online. Some of the examples that I'm going to use are aimed at kids. This is one example of an online site called Neopets, which is extremely popular. And I guess I want to argue that one of the things about these distractions and the number of them is that we may have to revise our thoughts about how diverse the media are and what kind of diversity is being offered. There's certainly the possibilities for lots of different kinds of distractions, and there also is the need very often for the media to attract us through certain kinds of novelty, right? And thus sometimes I think there are often possibly some ideological contradictions that occur, which mean that it doesn't always have the kind of ideological effect that the propaganda model argues. One example, one of my favorites of an ideological contradiction might be the kind of ideas that may be part of coming out of The Simpsons. And another example that I think is kind of interesting, I've done a lot of work on Disney, and I'm always trying to keep up with what they're doing. They have an online site called Toontown, which is really interesting in itself. It's by subscription, and one of the things that you do at this site is you kill, or you chase after these characters that are called cogs, and they're all corporate types, right? They're lawyers, bosses, accountants, and so forth. And what you do is you throw jokes at them, you throw water guns, pistols, but it's all a very kind of anti-corporate thing going on, which is just kind of strange for Disney. In other words, I think that within these distractions, some ideological messages may be coming out, yet the quest for profit, the quest to attract or distract audiences, and sometimes sell them to advertisers, sometimes leads to interesting contradictions. The quest for novelty in entertainment industries where no one knows what will sell may often lead to some kind of diversity, even sometimes surprising content and surprising themes. Very quickly, because of course I always overestimate how much time it will take. To summarize, I think that the propaganda model is more than just media bias. The subtitle, again, is the political economy of the mass media. And I think that should be emphasized as much as the propaganda model. And I wanted to kind of briefly do an overview of what is political economy of the mass media, but I'm thinking that I'm going to sail through this pretty quickly because many of you probably already know. Just to cite a few of our founding fathers, at the University of Illinois in the 40s, Dallas Smythe proposed political economy of communications as the study of structure and policies of communication. This was unusual at the time when people were studying effects and audiences. Our British friends, Peter Golding and Graham Murdoch, later proposed that critical political economy of media is about the study of media as commodities, as industries. Vincent Wasko more recently has described political economy in these terms, which some of you may be very familiar with, in that he's done the kind of a classic description of political economy, applying it to the media. I also want to add that there are a number of other experts in political economy, and some of them may be quite familiar to you. One would be Herbert Schiller, who also worked at the University of Illinois, directing his attention to international communication. Another was Tom Guback, who also studied at the University of Illinois and focused on film. Couldn't find a photo of him. And another is your colleague, Eileen Meehan, who is a renowned international expert. She said she liked this photo. Oh, okay. We'll get through it quickly then. On television, her book is a terrific example of that. And Ron Beddick, who also went to the University of Illinois, focusing on intellectual property. I want to just very quickly sail through these to give you examples of what we study. And one is commodities, and to use Disney as an example. The process of commodification, commodities, consumption, and consumers. We're interested in markets and competition. And for instance, in the film industry where Disney works, there is continuously this oligopoly where a handful of companies kind of dominate the industry. We look at industries as well as corporate organization, corporations looking at their diversified activities, studying how they work. We look at corporate strategies like synergy and integration, and just as an example, again, of Disney Times Square. We also look at globalization quite often as a strategy used by corporations. And also, I just like this photo too, corporate ownership and control. This is Disney's CEO. But how does that actually work? Where is control? Where is power? We also look at labor and media, of course. Interesting images of a recent strike at Disneyland just, brings that home. These were people who were protesting employee conditions. And also we look at the role of the state, the relationship with media. And this is quite interesting that there is often a nice relationship there with examples of similar kinds of interests. Also, there are examples, and we're interested in the relationship of regulation and the media. It's kind of an interesting image. And also, intellectual property, of course, is another issue that increasingly is very, very important, and of course has to do with kind of the essence of political economy in many ways. We do this historically because things do change, and we also know that they will continue to change. I want to just briefly end having kind of laid out a political economy, because I think that's really important to not just get stuck on Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model, but the whole political economy of media and how extensive it is. And I haven't done a great job of actually suggesting all of the different areas, but I want to just be whiny a little bit here and maybe defend political economy, because I've heard things recently that are things like, well, it's so pessimistic, just too pessimistic. It's old-fashioned, it's just, we've done, it's old-fashioned. It's not interesting anymore. It's overly critical. And the work is of dubious quality. It's like, not such great scholarship. And also, political economists really lack a sense of humor. They're so serious. They're so very, very serious. Well, I don't know. I'll be defensive. Another political economist that some of you may recognize is Nicholas Garnham, who is actually turning on political economy and saying it's really a tired and narrow orthodoxy. Well, to be whiny and defensive, yes, we're kind of pessimistic because we actually look at what's going on. I'm not quite sure that we're that pessimistic. We like to see, but we like to see things as they are, a materialist examination. And so that may sound a lot of times pessimistic. We also may be old-fashioned. We still sing those same old tunes, but geez, I don't know. Sometimes they make sense. Sometimes they explain what's going on in the world. And we also, I don't know. I'm not going to be defensive of this. I'm just going to say, what? Our work is of dubious quality? I don't know. For lacking a sense of humor, I just can't imagine. I think we have a great sense of humor because we're dealing with very serious issues, but also there's the possibility of observing what's going on in the world and also not having such a pessimistic view. I guess I should end with Gramsci, with where we always end in these discussions, with the optimism of the spirit, the pessimism of the mind. Actually, the pessimism of the mind comes first, the optimism of the spirit comes next. I'll end there, and thank you for your patience, and maybe we'll have some time to talk more.